Okay, so let's unpack this. We recently saw that really high-profile clash in the Oval Office between then-President Donald Trump and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa.
Yeah, that definitely got a lot of attention. And right at the center of it was this really striking accusation from Trump
Yeah.
that South Africa's white minority, the material you gave us says they're about, what, 7% of the population?
Yeah, around that.
That they're facing, targeted killings, looting, plunder. And some people, Trump included, were using terms like ethnic cleansing, even genocide.
And the tension in that meeting, you could almost feel it, couldn't you? Trump apparently showed a video,
Hmm.
and President Ramaphosa just pushed back hard, denied it was massive or systematic or organized, said it was, common crime.
And he also pointed out, which makes sense given the demographics,
Yeah.
that proportionally, Black South Africans are victims of violence far more often.
Exactly. And then Trump actually followed through, didn't he? The material shows he granted refugee status specifically to white South Africans.
Which was, well, pretty different from his administration's general approach to asylum, right?
Definitely.
And some analysts, the sources mention, saw a racial angle there. Like, why single out this group compared to others facing persecution worldwide?
Meanwhile, the South African government was holding its ground, denying any persecution of white citizens, calling the whole white genocide thing false.
They even questioned some of the evidence Trump apparently saw, suggesting it might not be real, or maybe not even from South Africa.
Genocide is such a heavy term. It implies a systematic plan, internationally recognized criteria.
Absolutely. It requires solid evidence of intent to destroy a group, not a label to be thrown around lightly.
And that's our cue. We're going to do a deep dive into the source material you provided, try to get past those big headlines and understand what the sources say is really happening on the ground.
Okay, so let's start with the data and the violence itself. The material actually frames that genocide claim right off the bat as probably a rather exaggerated interpretation.
Okay, exaggerated. But it does acknowledge that farmers, landowners, they are being killed.
Yeah.
And that most are white.
Yes, it confirms that. But here's the interesting part. The reason the material gives for why most victims are white,
Go on.
it links it directly to who owns the land. White South Africans, that 7% of the population, own almost 75% of the agricultural land.
75%. Wow.
Yeah, whereas the black majority, over 80% of the population, owns just over 4%.
Okay.
So the thinking presented in the material is, well, maybe the high number of white victims among farmers just reflects who owns the farms that are being targeted.
But you can't just look at farm attacks in isolation, right? The sources paint a picture of extreme violence across the whole country.
Oh, absolutely. South Africa has, according to this, the second highest homicide rate in the world, something like 45 per 100,000 people.
That's incredibly high.
And get this, between 1994 and 2018, over 500,000 violent deaths. The material even mentions one city, Pietermaritzburg, potentially being ranked the most dangerous in the world.
500,000 deaths. That's just staggering.
And it's tied to deeper issues.
Deep social problems, yes. Very high poverty, about 60% below the poverty line, the sources say. And inequality that's just off the charts. The material calls it the world's most extreme.
The Gini coefficient.
Yeah, 0.67. The top 10% hold 80% of the wealth. And the material notes a good chunk of that 10% is white.
So, okay, high violence, poverty, inequality. Why are farmers specifically targeted then, according to the sources?
Well, partly it's just the general environment of violence, but the material also points out farmers are seen as having money, and they're isolated. Rural areas make them easier targets.
Easier targets.
And there's a pattern mentioned too, quite grim. Attacks seem to spike around the end of the month.
When they'd have cash for wages.
Exactly. That's the suggestion.
But the material also gets into some really, really disturbing details about how these attacks happen.
Yes. It stresses that the way many of these attacks are carried out is truly sadistic. It's not just robbery.
So killing the landowners, their wives, sometimes the whole family, often involving sexual assault, even horrifically stripping body parts. The material explicitly says these are vicious crimes that do not fit in with a simple robbery for economic reasons.
That's horrific. It suggests something much darker than just theft.
It does. And then there's the issue of impunity, chaos in the police, the justice system.
Impunity, meaning people get away with it.
Largely, yes. The numbers are stark. Between 2018 and 2023, police reported about 115,000 murder cases. Over 76,000 of those were closed, unsolved.
76,000 unsolved murders in just 5 years.
tens of thousands. It creates this feeling, the material suggests, that criminals can act without consequences. Total impunity.
So you have this widespread, brutal violence, deep social problems, impunity. But does the data on the farm murder specifically point towards genocide against white people?
According to the material we have, no. It actually presents a strong counter-argument based on the numbers. Farm murders, as awful as they are a very small percentage of total violent deaths. And, importantly, the rate hasn't really increased for at least 5 years.
And there was another point about victims.
Yes, a key one. White South Africans make up about 7% of the population, right?
Right.
But they account for only 2% of all violent death victims. The material basically says, look, that does not seem to fit with the idea of genocide. You'd expect the targeted group to be killed in much higher proportions.
Okay, so summing up this part. The data doesn't back the genocide claim. But the overall violence is extreme, the country's in a bad way, described as a mess, and some of these farm attacks are undeniably sadistic and horrific.
Exactly. The specific nature of some crimes is deeply concerning, even if the overall numbers don't point to genocide.
Which maybe explains why, despite the data, the material says white South Africans do have reasons to be worried. What else is feeding that concern?
Well, the sources point very directly to a political figure, Julius Malema.
Ah, yes. Leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, described in the material as a textbook populist.
That's the term used, yes. He's a member of the National Assembly.
Yeah.
His platform is described as representing Marxism, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, and significantly black nationalism.
And he calls for
Nationalizing mines and banks. And, very explicitly, the massive expropriation of land owned by white people.
So he's directly targeting white landowners in his rhetoric. The material says he's kind of reviving racial division.
It suggests he's doing what Mandela fought against, stirring up racial hatred. It mentions him singing a particular song at rallies.
The Kill the Boer song.
That's the one often cited, yes. The material says it sets off all the alarms. Now, legally, the Equality Court in 2022 ruled it wasn't hate speech in context, seeing it as part of the anti-apartheid struggle history.
But the source presents it as problematic now.
It calls it a double-edged sword, suggesting that whatever its historical context, using it now could be fueling current tensions.
And his political strategy, according to the source.
It seems to be about capitalizing on South Africa's really difficult situation, blaming the country's problems on white people, radicalizing parts of the population.
Is it working? Is he gaining support?
His party's share of the vote has grown from 6% in 2014, the material says, to 11% in the last elections mentioned. So, yes, gaining traction.
And how does this kind of rhetoric connect back to the actual violence?
Well, the argument in the material is that when you have this kind of message, one of grievance, targeting a specific group, maybe even implicitly violent, reaching more people,
yeah,
it increases the chance that criminals committing these acts, like farm attacks, might feel somehow legitimized, like they have political backing, even if it's not explicit.
Okay, so you have the rhetoric, and then there's the actual legislation, the Expropriation Act, passed earlier this year, according to the material.
Yes, that's a major factor. Highly controversial.
Its stated goal is land reform, right?
Right.
Addressing apartheid's legacy.
That's the official purpose, yes. To redress the massive land inequality left by apartheid. And the historical context is undeniable. The material mentions the 1913 Native Land Act, the 1950 Group Areas Act, laws that systematically stripped black people of land.
And despite legal changes after apartheid, not much has changed on the ground in terms of ownership.
Hardly any changes in land distribution, is how the material puts it. So the need for reform is widely acknowledged. It's the method in this new law that's causing the uproar.
Which is.
It allows the government to expropriate land, and this is the really contentious part, potentially, without paying any compensation in certain circumstances. If the government decides it's fair, equitable, and in the public interest.
Wow. No compensation. The material called it a full frontal attack on private property.
Pretty strong language, yes. And it raises that difficult question the source touches on. Should people today, who maybe weren't involved in apartheid, bear the cost of fixing those historical wrongs this way?
It's a hugely complex debate.
And the material suggests this whole debate fuels the absolute worst in people: dehumanization, hatred, envy. It connects these feelings, these undercurrents, to what might be motivating some of those horrific crimes against farmers, even if statistically they aren't a genocide.
So, putting it all together, the specific brutal nature of some crimes, Malema's radical rhetoric, and now this Expropriation Act.
The consequence according to the source, is that a lot of white people, especially farmers, are genuinely scared. They're starting to pack up, thinking about leaving.
And it's that fear, that situation that got the U.S. involved.
That seems to be the trigger described in the material, yes. When Trump heard South Africa was pushing ahead with this law, one that would disproportionately affect the white minority.
He sent a warning.
A clear one.
Mm.
Stop it, or U.S. aid gets cut.
But Ramaphosa's government didn't blink.
They didn't back down, no.
And the aid was cut. How much are we talking?
The figure given is a little more than under $30 million. Not insignificant.
And the impact?
The material highlights the health sector particularly. That money financed 17% of South Africa's HIV program.
In a country with a 13% HIV prevalence rate, that's huge.
It's a significant impact, yes.
Now, what about the analysis of why Trump did this? Was it just about the land law?
Some analysts quoted in the material saw more to it. They suggested it might have been a kind of frame-up, meaning possibly linked to South Africa being the main country pushing the genocide complaint against Israel at the International Criminal Court.
Ah, okay.
So from that perspective, the public clash and the aid cut weren't just about land, but maybe also about punishing South Africa for its stance on Israel and trying to discredit them internationally.
Right. So let's try and wrap this up. The picture from the sources you provided is incredibly complex, isn't it? South Africa is dealing with enormous problems.
Yeah, the material paints a grim picture. Country in tatters, poverty, inequality getting worse, violent deaths overall jumping 25% in 6 years. Just huge structural issues.
And on the specific issue we started with, the data doesn't support a white genocide claim.
No, not according to the numbers presented. But, and this is crucial, the sources show white farmers do have valid reasons for deep concern.
Rooted in?
Rooted in the absolutely horrific, sadistic nature of some of the crimes against them. Rooted in the rise of political rhetoric, like Malema's, that explicitly targets them. And rooted in this new Expropriation Act, which the source itself calls rather reprehensible.
So it's not the systematic elimination you'd see in genocide. It's more like a country in severe decline. Widespread violence, chaos, impunity, and this growing specific anti-white narrative from one political faction.
That seems to be the picture emerging from the sources, yes. Generalized chaos mixed with specific targeted fears and worrying political and legislative developments.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a lot to think about. Considering what the sources show this nation grappling with its history, the extreme inequality, the violence, the political figures fanning flames, the controversial laws, how does digging into this complexity challenge, or maybe confirm, how you initially saw this situation unfolding in South Africa?